Before becoming the final stage of the regime, the Führerbunker was, in its origin, a defensive project that grew in stages, almost like a wound deepening at the pace of the war. Its history did not begin in 1945, but in the years when Berlin still wanted to present itself to the world as an orderly, modern capital, capable of organizing the Olympic Games while at the same time supporting the power theater of the Reich. In 1936, in that context of construction and expansions around the Chancellery, the first shelter was built, the Vorbunker, a preliminary basic bunker designed as temporary protection against air attacks. That Vorbunker was not yet the underground fortress that would later occupy the collective imagination. It was a shallow refuge located under the main garden of the Chancellery, with concrete walls about 1 meter thick and access via a staircase from the basement of the building. Its function was elementary, to allow key personnel to go down, wait for the end of an alarm and go back up. It was not conceived as a headquarters, nor as a residence, nor as the core of a prolonged command. It was insurance against the unpredictable, a quick solution for a risk that in 1936 could be imagined but was not yet experienced as a fate. The war changed the scale of everything. In September 1939, with the outbreak of the conflict and especially with the sustained increase in British and American bombings, that first shelter began to prove insufficient. The city, which previously reinforced buildings out of caution, began to reinforce them out of necessity. The temporary protection ceased to be a pause and approached the idea of permanence. From 1943, when Germany had already lost air superiority and the sky ceased to be an ally, Hitler ordered the construction of a deeper, more resilient shelter connected to the Vorbunker, but with defensive characteristics unmatched for a civilian facility. That technical leap was not minor. It was not a matter of adding meters of concrete and going a little deeper, but of creating a complex capable of functioning as an autonomous organism in the midst of a collapsed city. The Hochtief Company undertook the construction under the direction of engineers from the Chancellery's Works Office, and here appears a dimension that, in accounts of the final days, often remains out of focus: the human cost of erecting that structure. The work was carried out mostly with forced labor, Soviet prisoners of war, political detainees transferred from concentration camps, and foreign workers from occupied territories, working in continuous shifts, with days of more than 12 hours in conditions of malnutrition and disease. Discipline was imposed through direct violence by the SS, and later testimonies speak of a significant death toll during excavation and wall construction. While speeches of strength were proclaimed on the surface below, digging was done with exhausted bodies, and the bunker was already born marked by a brutal logic: the survival of a few built on the extreme exhaustion of many. It was not a side detail, it was part of the regime's mechanics. Even the space intended to protect the leader was built with methods of coercion and suffering. In engineering terms, the Führerbunker reached an approximate depth of 8 meters below the surface and was reinforced with reinforced concrete walls and ceilings between 2.5 and 3.5 meters thick. The structure had 18 rooms connected by narrow, angular corridors, sealed with airtight steel doors. The design did not seek comfort, it sought resilience and containment. The architecture resembled a helmet more than a house, more a security chamber than a residence. Autonomy was a priority. A ventilation system with filters designed against combat gases was installed, along with potable water storage, independent electric generators, and diesel fuel tanks to sustain weeks of operation without relying on the city's network. It was, in essence, a small world capable of remaining alive if the outside world ran out of air, energy, or water. And yet, that autonomy had a disturbing character. The more self-sufficient the bunker was, the easier it was to become trapped inside it. The complex was divided into 2 levels. The upper level, corresponding to the original bunker, housed kitchens, storage rooms, and auxiliary personnel quarters, including secretaries and administrative employees. The lower core concentrated the quarters of Hitler and Eva Braun, a military conference room, a strategic maps room, rooms for high-ranking officers, an equipped infirmary, and armament storage. The distribution reflected hierarchies: above, support; below, command; and between the 2 levels, the idea that the life of the inner circle should remain as far as possible from direct impact. There were also emergency exits connected to various points in the Chancellery garden, although some became unusable due to collapses in the final months of the war. This almost technical note says a lot. Even a shelter designed to resist could be deformed by the reality of the siege. It is not just about walls, but about the terrain, the explosions, the progressive collapse of the surface, which can close exits, block stairs, and turn an escape plan into a wall of debris. Inside, the design followed strictly functional criteria. The rooms were small, with low ceilings, no windows, and coated with acoustic plaster to reduce reverberation. Lighting depended entirely on electric lamps, creating a perpetually artificial environment. There was no day, only on and off. The temperature was kept low due to depth and insulation, a stable cold that could be advantageous in terms of protection, but also made the place more inhospitable. Furniture was reduced to essentials: iron beds, metal desks, utility tables. That interior, without ornamentation, contrasted with the ceremonial image the regime had built on the surface. Large halls, marble symbols, architecture designed to impress. The bunker was the opposite, a tool. And like every tool, it was permeated by the obsession of its owner. The project was marked by Hitler's direct supervision, who during his visits demanded constant modifications: thicker walls, reinforced doors, ventilation capable of withstanding prolonged chemical attacks. He even threatened severe penalties for engineers who did not meet specifications. This insistence reveals a central trait. The Führer bunker was not just a technical response to bombings, it was a psychological response to the fear of being reached. The design, with airtight doors and chemical warfare filters, spoke of a paranoia turned into concrete. And the more the shelter was reinforced, the more an idea was consolidated that years later would become literal, that the end would occur down there. By April 1945, the bunker already existed as a prepared space, but also as a stage. It was not only built, it was charged with meaning. It had become the place where command separated from the real country, where the war could continue on paper while the outside world collapsed. In its angular corridors, life was reduced to small routines: opening and closing steel doors, crossing narrow corridors, going up and down between levels, holding conversations in low voices so that the sound did not bounce off the walls, relying on the electric hum to feel that the place was still functioning. The structure was designed to withstand heavy bombings and chemical attacks, and that very capacity for resilience made it a difficult place to abandon when the city above no longer offered safe passage. The last orders, maps, fury, and an ending, written in short messages. The Führer bunker no longer functioned as a refuge when Berlin was closing in on itself. It functioned as an isolated command room, where the war continued to exist in the form of arrows, symbols, and unit names, even though on the surface those units were disintegrating. In those days, tactical assessment meetings became discussions loaded with reproaches, with generals turned into direct targets of Hitler's anger. The pattern repeated itself. News arrived confirming an irreversible collapse, and yet he obsessively insisted on counterattacks that had no real basis, along with severe punishments for officers unable to carry out directives that were practically impossible. On April 22nd, that gap between order and reality exploded. Hitler realized that General Felix Steiner's offensive had never taken place. It had not happened not due to disobedience, but because of a total lack of troops and resources. It was then that he erupted into a crisis of extreme fury. He shouted that the war was definitively lost and that everything had been betrayed by his own commanders. And after that outburst, he pronounced something that inside the bunker sounded like a sentence. He announced for the first time his irrevocable decision to remain in Berlin until the end, and to die there if necessary. That announcement changed the internal climate. Up to that moment, there was still the possibility of imagining a transfer, an escape to the south, a retreat to Bavaria, or to safer military installations. Several close collaborators presented viable alternatives, but the refusal was absolute and definitive. In the bunker, that no was not just a choice. It was an order that dragged along everyone who remained inside. From that point, every move was interpreted in the light of a single certainty. The end would occur there, in that sealed underground space, and every subsequent decision would be made under that shadow. The following days were marked by an increasing isolation from the outside world. The circle that remained in the bunker was not numerous, but it represented the final core of power. There was Eva Braun, the long-term companion maintained for years in a private sphere. Also Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda, along with Magda and their 6 children. Martin Bormann coordinated internal activities as head of the party chancellery and a central figure of the regime. The secretaries, Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian and Elsa Kruger, sustained the work of dictation, filing and typing. The doctors, Theodor Morell and Ludwig Stumpfegger, attended to physical decline and exhaustion. And around them, members of the SS Personal Guard maintained a vigilance that no longer protected a future, but an outcome. In that confinement, the war became a sequence of urgent, short communications, sometimes almost telegraphic, even when going beyond Morse code. Later exploration of the bunker decades afterward recovered a hermetically sealed metal cabinet in the communications room. Inside were folders containing records of Morse transmissions from the final days of April, with messages dated between the 28th and 30th, directed to isolated units or internal personnel. Among them, one stood out for its brevity and definitive tone. "No way out. Final procedure confirmed." Researchers interpreted this phrase as an explicit acceptance that there would be no evacuation or surrender, that the outcome was planned inside the bunker. This message aligns with what happened on April 28th, when Hitler received reports of Heinrich Himmler's betrayal, who had attempted to secretly negotiate with the Western Allies without knowledge or authorization. The revelation enraged him to the point of issuing immediate arrest orders against someone who had been one of his closest collaborators for decades. That same day, he also received news of Benito Mussolini's execution in Italy and the public display of his corpse. The image of the fallen ally, turned into a trophy, reinforced his conviction that he must not be captured alive under any circumstances. Inside the Führer bunker, that conviction translated into administrative and personal decisions that no longer looked toward the continuity of the Reich but toward controlling the end. During the night of April 28th to 29th, he dictated to Traudl Junge his political will and personal testament. In the political document, he justified his decisions, blamed the Jews for the European catastrophe, and named successors: Karl Dönitz as president of the Reich and Joseph Goebbels as chancellor of the new government. In the private testament, he officially recognized his relationship with Eva Braun and declared his intention to marry her before the end. It was a belated formality, hastily drafted in the midst of a siege but full of meaning. If the outside world collapsed, at least there would remain a written record, a controlled version of what had happened. Meanwhile, command remained glued to maps. This impulse is materially recorded in what appeared decades later in Hitler's private office. Maps of Berlin and Central Europe in various states of preservation, some disintegrated, others stuck together by moisture. On a map of Berlin, red pencil annotations, arrows, and military symbols representing the Soviet advance on the capital were visible. Handwriting specialists noted that several of these annotations matched Hitler's writing, confirming his direct participation in monitoring the situation until the end. The image that emerges is simple and brutal. Even after announcing that he would die in Berlin, he continued to draw lines on paper, as if the act of marking the map could sustain a form of control. The bunker, then, was not only a physical refuge. It was a laboratory of final decisions, where the world was reduced to corridors, tense meetings, coded messages, and objects that now appear corroded. In the explorations of 2024 and subsequent months, teams found remnants of electrical wiring, metal parts of radio equipment, and an empty fuel tank consistent with technical descriptions of the complex. In the personal quarters, a rusted cot with remnants of a deteriorated blanket and metal fragments that seemed to belong to a collapsed sofa was identified. They also observed burn marks on interior walls compatible with the attempted incineration of Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies and with the effects of the final bombings. Every physical finding seemed to confirm the gradual transformation of the place, from operational center to sealed scenario. In the sealed communications cabinet, Morse messages dated between the 28th and 30th appeared as a compressed narration of the collapse, directed at isolated units that were already fighting like islands. And within the same set of findings, the presence of objects linked to the Goebbels family appeared in a disturbing way. Metal glasses matching those Joseph Goebbels habitually wore, according to medical records of the time, and a deteriorated stuffed rabbit with dried bloodstains, associated by specialists with the documented presence of the 6 children poisoned before their parents' suicide. Testaments and wedding. The dawn, when the Reich became paper. Inside the Führer bunker, the night of April 28th was not an ordinary night. It was the kind of night when everything boils down to decisions from which there is no return. The city was surrounded, the surface air was a constant artillery strike, and the outside world became a rumor filtered through the mechanical ventilation. Down there, time began to be measured differently. Not by clocks, but by communications that arrived late, by visits to the map room, by the repeated sequence of steel doors opening and closing as if each metallic bang were a reminder of confinement. Hitler was no longer in the phase of denying defeat. He was in the phase of managing an end. The immediate trigger was the news of Heinrich Himmler's secret maneuver, who had attempted to negotiate with the Western Allies without authorization. The information fell like a personal humiliation, not a political calculation. For Hitler, that act confirmed an idea that had been maturing for days, that the defeat was not only military but moral, that the collapse of the Reich was also the collapse of loyalty. His response was immediate and extreme. He ordered arrests and sought to impose punishments even when he no longer controlled the territory or the apparatus that was supposed to carry them out. But that same night came another blow, different in nature, the news of Benito Mussolini's execution and the public display of his corpse. What shocked Hitler was not only the death of his ally, but the image of the defeated leader turned into an object. That vision summarized in a brutal way what he feared as a personal fate, being captured alive, being exhibited, being stripped of the last ounce of control. From that moment, the idea of an escape was erased by an obsession. If the end was inevitable, it must at least be an end of his choosing. For this reason, the dawn from April 28th to 29th became a kind of race against the collapse. Not a race to save the regime, but to fix its final version. Hitler dictated two distinct documents to his secretary Traudl Junge, as if he were ordering the administrative closure of a life and a state at the same time. On one hand, the political testament, a complete justification of his decisions, a rewriting of responsibilities, and a final command structure. On the other hand, the personal testament, a late, intimate formality in which he officially acknowledged his relationship with Eva Braun and established that he would marry her before the end. In the bunker, the act of dictating was more than a procedure. It was a cold ceremony. Words became a form of control, the only one still available. The Reich, which had been born with propaganda and mass mobilization, died, transformed into typewritten paragraphs, signed underground, while above the buildings crumbled. There was something revealing in that contrast, the grandeur of previous years compressed into a small room, with a typewriter, a lamp, and the muffled sound of war. The choice of successors also revealed the real situation. In the political testament, Hitler appointed Karl Dönitz as president of the Reich and Joseph Goebbels as chancellor. It was a distribution that attempted to maintain the form of a state when the content had been lost. Practically, there was no longer an operational capital, no solid front, no intact administrative networks remained. But the document aimed to preserve continuity, as if an appointment could deny the total fragmentation of the country. Then came the personal side. The relationship with Eva Braun had existed for years in an almost clandestine space. She had been kept in the background, carefully isolated from the public representation of the regime. However, in the bunker, in the final days, Braun was no longer a peripheral secret. She was part of the core that accepted the end. The decision to marry was not a gesture toward the future. It was precisely a gesture of closure. It was not about founding a life together, but about sealing an identity, leaving an official record, fixing a surname before disappearing. The ceremony took place in the early hours of April 29th in one of the smallest rooms of the bunker. There was no music or extensive formalities. It was officiated by Walter Wagner, a minor Nazi Party official, and had very few witnesses. Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels were present as figures of a circle that now resembled more a funeral guard than a government. Eva Braun officially adopted the Hitler surname, and that detail gained a strange weight in a world falling apart. It was a registry change at the heart of an absolute defeat. The celebration was minimal, almost grotesquely small for a regime that had made aesthetics and ceremony instruments of power. Instead of a grand event, there was a brief breakfast, champagne and a cake prepared by the kitchen staff, nothing else. And that brevity, far from being an anecdotal detail, spoke of the emotional state of the place. No one truly celebrated. A formality was carried out, a gesture of final belonging was made, and then one returned to the gravity of confinement. From that ceremony, the bunker returned to its main task, ordering the closure. Hitler meticulously reviewed the final documents and gave precise instructions for copies of the political testament to be distributed. What was written underground had to travel to an already fractured country. For this, specially selected messengers were chosen with a nearly suicidal mission: leave the bunker, cross Soviet lines, and reach different points in Germany. There is an intense paradox in this act. While the leader assumed he would die in Berlin, he still needed his word to circulate for the document to survive, even if his body did not. Some messengers successfully delivered the texts. This allowed the documents to exist after the war as proof and as part of historical reconstruction. But at that moment, inside the bunker, the distribution was also a form of self-assertion, an attempt to show that command was still operating, that it could still order something beyond its own end. That night and day left a feeling that in later accounts became a pattern. The end was not a single instant, it was an accumulation of small actions that closed doors. Marrying, signing, dictating, appointing, selecting messengers, reviewing papers. Each gesture replaced military strategies that no longer made sense. The bunker was becoming, hour by hour, a closure office. And in parallel, the communications machinery recorded the inevitable in short phrases. The messages transmitted in the last days of April had the tone of a structure already preparing to shut down. The idea of a final procedure was not a metaphor, it was an operational summary. There would be no evacuation, no surrender. There would be a planned outcome inside the bunker. The war, which for years had been expansion, was reduced to a fixed point. When dawn broke on April 29th, the bunker was a slightly different place than the day before. On paper, Hitler had already designed his own exit from the world. Personally, he had already formalized what he had kept in the shadows for years. Politically, he had tried to leave a continuity that could not really be sustained. Outside, Berlin continued to fall. Inside, the regime was already becoming an archive. April 30th, the shot, the poison, and the fire in the garden. On April 30th, 1945, the day began in the Führer bunker with a calm that seemed out of place, as if the place had learned to create an artificial normality amid the collapse. Hitler had breakfast with his secretaries without raising his voice much, with that kind of brief conversation that did not build the future but only filled the minutes. After lunch, he met with officers to evaluate the tactical situation one last time, but there was no longer an organized front. Berlin was encircled, and German units fought as isolated points, retreating with no real room to maneuver. In the map room, the lines that had once moved with hope now shrank by pure inertia, and the command only noted what the artillery noise had been signaling for days. In that atmosphere, the bunker functioned like a capsule still following internal rules, even though the city above was going through its final phase. The steel doors opened and closed repeatedly, like a mechanical ritual. The corridors, narrow and angular, contained glances that avoided lingering too long. No one asked what will happen, because everyone knew. The real question was when, and above all, how. In the early afternoon hours, Hitler did something that, within the logic of the regime, seemed almost intimate. He said goodbye individually to several members of his inner circle. It was not a speech, there was no rallying cry. It was a human, dry walkthrough, as if he were closing a list of names before disappearing. Some received a handshake, others a brief phrase. The secretaries watched him pass with a rigidity that was not theatrical. It was the body of a man who no longer managed a war, but an end. At that moment, his decision was no longer open to discussion. It had already been implemented. Shortly afterward, he retired to his private quarters, accompanied only by Eva Braun. The gesture was clear. What was about to happen had to remain as contained as possible, without an audience, without intervention, without witnesses who could alter it. In the outer hallway, two figures waited: Heinz Linger, his personal valet, and Martin Bormann. They remained at a distance from the door, with the tense stillness of those who wait for a signal they do not want to hear, but know is inevitable. Time stretched. In the bunker, the silence was not absolute. There was the electrical hum, the filtered air, the dull thud of distant explosions, and sometimes vibrations that ran through the walls like an underground echo. Yet, in that stretch of waiting, everything seemed suspended in a point. until around 3:30 p.m., a sharp shot was heard from inside the room. A brief, definitive sound that did not need to be repeated. The reaction was immediate. Linge and Bormann entered without delay. What they found, according to later testimonies, was Hitler seated on a sofa with a gunshot wound to his right temple and Eva Braun dead from cyanide poisoning. Hitler had also ingested a cyanide capsule before shooting himself with his personal pistol, a Walther PPK. The weapon was there next to the bodies, along with small bottles that had contained the poison capsules. There was no heroic scene or cinematic solemnity. The end occurred in an enclosed space with small objects capable of ending the life of someone who had commanded armies. In the seconds that followed, the bunker ceased to be a command center and became a procedure. There was no room for visible shock because everything had already been planned. Hitler had given specific instructions. His body was not to be left available to the enemy. He did not want to be displayed. He did not want to become a trophy. Therefore, the next step was not to mourn or improvise. It was to execute an order. His closest aides wrapped both bodies in military blankets. They did it carefully, not out of ceremonial respect, but because the movement needed to be quick and clean. At that moment, any delay meant risk. The fighting was approaching. The artillery was striking, and the complex could be compromised at any time. The bodies had to be taken out of the bunker, brought to the surface, and destroyed before the Soviet advance reached the Chancellery Garden. The operation was risky by definition. They moved the bodies to the gardens through exits that connected the underground to the surface. Outside, Berlin was not an open stage. It was an urban center turned to ruins with smoke, shrapnel, explosions and craters appearing where roads once were. They chose one of those craters, deep, created by a Soviet bomb. There they placed the wrapped bodies and, without delay, poured gasoline from cans stored in the bunker itself over them. The fire started immediately. It was an improvised exposed blaze without stable conditions under constant bombardment. Under other circumstances, complete incineration would have required time, sufficient fuel, and continuity impossible in this context. But they tried anyway because the goal was clear: to reduce the bodies as much as possible before the surroundings forced them to stop. The process was incomplete. The reason was not mysterious. There were constant bombings, and the available fuel was not enough to ensure total destruction. The flames consumed part of the bodies, but not enough. The remains were partially charred. In the end, they covered them with soil displaced by the continuous explosions, a mixture of earth and rubble that served as an improvised, almost immediate burial, done outdoors and without ceremony. It was, in essence, a desperate attempt at concealment, not burial. That moment, seen from inside the bunker, closed a cycle of control. Hitler had withdrawn from the war without surrendering and without leaving his body as public proof. But the same gesture opened the next problem for those left behind. The bunker no longer had a leader, and the city continued to fall. From that point on, the question was not what to do for Germany, it was what to do with themselves. Some had already decided on suicide. Others still imagined an escape, although the Soviet encirclement made every meter a sentence. And as the fire died down in the crater, the bunker closed again with a new silence. The silence that remains when a regime is not only losing a war, but losing its center. The Soviet capture remains, dentition, and the secret that fueled the myth. After April 30th, the Führer bunker ceased to be a command center and became an object of pursuit. Not only because of the symbolic value of the place, but because of the question that at that moment dominated every military and political conversation: where was Hitler? Berlin was falling in layers. On the surface, fighting continued for hours and days as a struggle over specific buildings, avenues, stations and basements. Underground, the bunker remained a suspicious cavity, a black spot on the map, a possible hiding place, a possible tomb, a possible deception. When the first Soviet troops arrived in the Chancellery area, what they found was not an underground palace filled with relics, but an almost empty environment with scattered prisoners and abandoned corpses. The impression was that of a chaotic evacuation. The power had withdrawn, leaving traces, but not a complete scene. In the vicinity of an underground exit, however, a discovery appeared that changed everything. Charred remains superficially buried in a crater, later identified as those of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. The attempt at cremation had been rushed and partially failed. leaving something that history would pursue for decades: fragments, not complete bodies. Identification went poorly from the start because the evidence was not clean. The Soviets did not find a recognizable corpse, but a collection of partial bone remains, dental pieces, and skull fragments damaged by explosions. In a context where the ground had been bombed and disturbed repeatedly, each fragment could belong to someone else, each bone could have been displaced, and each testimony could be contaminated by fear or self-interest. The incomplete cremation and fragmentary preservation created an ideal scenario for confusion, and that confusion became the first fuel of the myth. Because of the political importance of the discovery, the case did not remain in the hands of a simple combat unit. The Soviet military counterintelligence, known as SMERSH, assumed control of the investigation. From then on, the Führerbunker ceased to be a battle site and became an investigation scene under the logic of state security. Teams meticulously collected everything that could be useful: human remains, weapons, scattered documents, damaged communication equipment. Objects were confiscated that would later reappear in historical reconstructions: maps with handwritten notes, Morse transmission records from the last days of April, personal materials of the bunker occupants. The goal was twofold: to confirm the dictator's death and to appropriate any document that could contain valuable military or political information for the post-war period. All this material was packed and sent to Moscow. The decision was not only technical but strategic. If definitive evidence of Hitler's death existed, the Soviet Union wanted to be the only actor with full control over it. The bunker, in terms of archives, became loot, and within that loot there was one element that proved decisive above all: the dentition. In a world destroyed by bombs, dentistry became evidence. The recovered dental material was compared with existing dental records and analyzed by military specialists. And then came the piece that closed the circle: the interrogation of German medical personnel linked to Hitler. Among those interrogated was Käthe Häusermann, assistant to dentist Hugo Blaschke, who confirmed the exact correspondence between the recovered remains and the dental procedures performed on the dictator, including prosthetics and dental bridges. It was a surgical precision identification amid the chaos. It did not depend on recognizing a face, but on recognizing a specific dental work, recorded and reproducible. Even so, the story did not end there. The Soviet logic was not that of an investigation seeking transparency, but that of a power seeking political advantage. Despite dental confirmation, Soviet authorities issued contradictory statements. In the first days after Berlin's fall, they publicly claimed there was no conclusive evidence of Hitler's death. Weeks later, internal reports recognized positive identification. But that information was not openly disclosed. In other words, they knew but chose not to say it. The decision to maintain ambiguity was not a bureaucratic accident. According to the documents mentioned in the report material, it was a direct determination by Joseph Stalin, who considered it useful to maintain uncertainty as a political tool in the post-war period. That uncertainty operated on several levels. It sowed doubts among Western allies, fueled diplomatic tensions, and projected the image that the Soviet Union was the only actor capable of approaching the truth about the last days of the Reich. This strategy was expressed even in international scenarios. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Stalin told Truman and Churchill that Hitler might have escaped from Berlin. The claim contradicted the evidence his own services had already gathered, but it was not an error, it was a maneuver. Saying he might have escaped forced the others to think about escape routes, clandestine networks, hidden negotiations. It turned the immediate post-war period into unstable ground, useful for those controlling the real information. In parallel, disinformation had a global expansion effect. The intelligence services of the United States, Great Britain, and France collected reports of alleged sightings. Some placed him in Spain under Francois protection, others in German communities in Argentina. The lack of Soviet confirmation gave oxygen to these hypotheses. Even during the Nuremberg trials, when several Nazi leaders affirmed that Hitler had died in Berlin, there persisted an international impression of a lack of conclusive evidence. The press inevitably amplified that ambiguity with contradictory headlines. For some media, the end was confirmed. For others, the story was still open. Meanwhile, within the Soviet Union, the custody of the remains became a matter of national security. Documents mention that the remains were secretly buried in Magdeburg after being incinerated again, with the exact location classified. Years later, that custody continued under a protocol of extreme silence. It was not only about hiding a fact, but preventing the place from becoming a symbolic focus, a point of attraction for future extremist cults or rival propaganda. Decades later, the fate of the remains took a definitive turn. In 1946, they were moved to Magdeburg and buried in military facilities. And in 1970, with the transfer of those facilities to the German Democratic Republic, the remains were exhumed, completely incinerated, and the ashes thrown into the Elbe River to prevent any future symbolic cult. It was not about justice or ceremony, it was an administrative elimination of the object, an attempt to erase the possibility that a physical fragment could become a political relic. However, the result was the opposite on a cultural level, because when there is no access to evidence, the void is filled with versions. Soviet opacity favored the persistence of survival theories, sometimes used for sensationalist purposes and others for ideological purposes. Researchers, journalists, and writers published works based on doubtful testimonies and rumors impossible to verify. Ambiguity became a factory of stories, and each decade added layers, supposed monasteries, underwater routes, doubles, escapes through impossible tunnels. Doubts were reinforced by the fragmentary state of the remains and by the fact that no Western researcher had access to the fragments held in Moscow under maximum secrecy. Dental pieces were stored in secret archives and were not publicly shown for decades. The skull and other remains remained under KGB custody, with display limited only after the fall of the Soviet Union. That documentary confinement functioned as an extension of the bunker itself. Not only was the place sealed, but the evidence was sealed as well. Silence and erasure, demolitions, GDR, and the disappearance of the site. After the Soviet takeover, the Führer bunker ceased to be a command center and became a political problem. It was not just a set of underground rooms, it was a symbol, a dangerous symbol for two opposing reasons. For the victors, it was the regime's last stage, a place that could feed myths if left intact. For the survivors of Nazism, it was a potentially venerable site, a pilgrimage point, an underground altar capable of surviving defeat. This dual condition made it something that could not be managed as a simple destroyed building. In the months following 1945, Berlin was a city made of ruins and urgencies. Rebuilding was not an aesthetic project, it was a vital necessity. Streets had to be cleared, debris removed, housing improvised, basic services restored. In that context, the bunker could have remained just another cavity, a concrete structure lost among the remains. But it was not. It was associated with a name that continued to carry global weight. For this reason, from early on, the priority was that the site not remain accessible, and that its existence not turn into a narrative parallel to reconstruction. The management policy was, first, one of control and sealing. The Chancellery area became a supervised space with restricted access and surveillance. The goal was to prevent the site from being explored by the curious, looters, or future admirers. But sealing did not solve the underlying problem. As long as the structure remained, the myth had a possible body. A bunker is, by definition, something that can survive surface changes. That was the dilemma. Over the following years, attempts were made to destroy it. And here emerges an uncomfortable truth. The Führer bunker was difficult to eliminate even with political will. Its walls and ceilings had been built to withstand bombings. What in war was protection, in peacetime became an obstacle to demolition. Authorities tried to blow it up with explosives, but the structure largely resisted. Some sections collapsed, others were damaged, but the deep core continued to exist as a stubborn block. Completely demolishing it would have required enormous effort in machinery, explosives, and time in a city that had immediate survival priorities. For this reason, the strategy shifted from destroy to bury and erase. Accesses were filled, entrances collapsed, the ground covered with layers of rubble. The idea was simple. If it could not be removed, it could be made invisible. The bunker had to cease being a place, becoming an absence. When Berlin was divided and the area came under the control of the German Democratic Republic, the symbolic problem became even more delicate. The GDR built its legitimacy on state anti-fascism, a narrative in which Nazism was a disease of the past, defeated by Soviet liberation. Allowing an underground sanctuary in the city center did not fit this narrative. not only because of the risk of a clandestine cult, but because the site could become a morbid attraction, a market for historical curiosity difficult to control. The GDR did not want an involuntary monument, it wanted a void. Thus, the plan was not to museumize or explain, it was to disappear. The area was urbanized with the logic of deliberate erasure. The landscape was modified, infrastructure built, buildings erected to normalize the site. No plaques were placed, no public memory promoted of the exact point. For years, the site remained under layers of fill and construction that made it inaccessible to the average citizen. The bunker continued to exist as a volume, but its relationship with the surface was cut off, as if a wound had been sealed under a thick bandage. The result was a paradox. Physical erasure fueled narrative erasure, but narrative erasure fueled imagination. Because when a site so loaded with history becomes invisible, the human mind tends to complete it. Rumors emerged, endless tunnels, secret exits, intact rooms, doors that still opened. And each rumor, even if false, functions as a form of presence. It is the classic mechanism of myth. The less it is seen, the more it is believed. Over the decades, central Berlin changed its skin multiple times. The city became something else, and that other needed to reorganize its memory map. When the wall fell and Germany was reunified, the question of Nazi sites in urban space re-emerged with new intensity. What should be done with these sites? Should they be marked, hidden, explained, left buried? In that debate, the Führerbunker had an additional problem. Its exact location was known to specialists, but access was impractical and, above all, politically uncomfortable. In the years following reunification, the area where the bunker stood was incorporated into a common urban grid: streets, residential buildings, parking lots. Efforts were made to make the site stop looking like a site. Not a center of power, not a historical site, but a normal city segment. This attempt at normalization succeeded on the surface. For a long time, tourists and residents walked through the area without any visible sign indicating what lay beneath. And that was precisely the intention, that the landscape not invite fascination. But memory does not disappear just because it is not signposted. Memory transforms. Instead of physical pilgrimage, narrative pilgrimage emerged. Books, documentaries, 3D reconstructions, virtual tours, repeated testimonies. The bunker became a cultural object, a reproducible symbol without the need to open the real door. And by becoming reproducible, it also became manipulable, from historical rigor to sensationalism, from serious research to conspiracy. In that context, silencing had a cost. For years, public debate did not focus on the site as evidence, but on the site as an idea. And when a site becomes a concept, the ground is left open to interpretation. The Führerbunker became a word that anyone could fill with the version they wanted. For some, the last refuge of a defeated monster. For others, a piece of morbid curiosity. For deniers or conspiracy theorists, an open stage for fantasy. For historians and urban planners, an extreme example of how a city decides what to remember and what to cover. The most unsettling aspect is that erasure worked in two directions. On one hand, it prevented the possibility of a visible cult at a precise point on the map. On the other hand, it left history without a concrete anchor for the majority of the population. When there is no place that forces you to look straight at it, the past can become abstract, and the abstract can become comfortable. The Führerbunker, buried and inaccessible, was for decades the perfect example. A core of history buried beneath a city that preferred to walk above it without looking down. And yet what was buried was not dead. It remained as a volume and as an echo. The city had covered it, but the concrete was still there, resisting as it had resisted the bombs. This material resistance explained why the bunker kept returning in historical discussions, because what is not completely destroyed tends to come back. And the Führerbunker, though invisible, continued waiting beneath the surface as if its true condition were not that of a building, but of a secret. The return, 2024, and the first documented descent in almost 8 decades. For decades, the Führerbunker existed as an urban rarity, a real underground volume, and at the same time a non-existent place on the surface. It had no signage, no access, no clear official account for passers-by. It was a non-place built by political decision out of fear that it could become a point of attraction for extremists due to symbolic discomfort and as part of a prolonged strategy of institutional silence. The result of that process was almost perfect. In everyday terms, the bunker had disappeared. But concrete does not evaporate by decree. Beneath layers of soil, fill, urban redevelopment and altered maps, the complex remained as a physical persistence that did not match public memory. This contrast is what makes what happened in 2024 extraordinary. It was not a curiosity excursion or a tourist project. It was an exceptional scientific authorization granted after prolonged negotiations between academic institutions, German authorities, and international historical preservation organizations. The permit was issued under strict conditions: exclusive access for research, no public opening, no political or propaganda use, with a closed security perimeter and technical protocols that turned every entry into a controlled operation. The initial difficulty was not only ethical or political, it was technical. Finding a point of entry required months of preparation because the bunker was not waiting to be opened. The historical entrances had been sealed with rubble and concrete, access routes had been annulled, and available plans were unreliable. Some maps from the German Democratic Republic era had been redrawn with altered coordinates, and cadastral records had ceased to mention the site. The search became a reconstruction, cross-referencing historical aerial photographs, fragmentary testimonies, and geophysical studies capable of reading beneath modern urban layers. The decisive tool was a deep penetration ground radar combined with surface analysis and comparative review of old images. That work eventually identified a candidate that did not look like a door, but a scar, an old collapsed ventilation shaft under a sidewalk in the area of the street or layout related to Vossstrasse and its immediate surroundings. The choice of the point was revealing. It was not about opening a normal entrance, but finding a structural remnant that had survived the attempt to erase it, something that connected to the void without the need to reconstruct the original access. Once the point was identified, another stage began: safety engineering. The area was reinforced with metal supports and a perimeter closed to the public was established. Every measure was a warning. The ground could give way, the concrete could fracture, and a poorly calculated excavation operation could cause collapses in internal sections. What was being opened was not a dry, stable room, but a cavity degraded by humidity, pressure, and corrosion accumulated over almost 8 decades. Before allowing a person to descend, technology was sent first. Drones equipped with high-resolution cameras, gas sensors, and radiation detectors entered through the newly enabled access. This order was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The devices confirmed something that common sense already suggested, but needed measurement. The interior air was toxic. High levels of carbon dioxide, fungal spores, and decomposition gases accumulated in the closed environment for decades were detected. Under these conditions, the space was lethal without protection. The Führer bunker remained a refuge in reverse logic. It did not protect the entrant, it put them at risk. The initial drone images showed an underground landscape more akin to a shipwreck than a building. Corridors blocked by collapses, stagnant water, mold-covered walls, corroded metal structures, and absolute air stagnation that turned every corner into a closed chamber. The temperature was low, stable, and humidity had become the great agent of slow destruction. Where the wartime architecture had been designed to withstand explosions, the silent enemy had been time, leaks, condensation, and oxidation. Only after these verifications was human descent authorized, with protective suits, respiratory equipment, independent lighting, and a communication system designed to fail as little as possible. Entering the bunker meant accepting that the environment could degrade even the instruments. Mold and humidity affected materials, dust could be biologically dangerous, and corrosion caused metal parts to disintegrate upon contact or vibration. The researchers did not walk through the place as one visits a historical site. They worked it as one works an unstable structure, with limited stays, team rotation, prior ventilation before each incursion, and strict cataloguing processes upon exit. Each entry was a small, complete cycle: prepare the air, assess stability, enter, record, collect samples, exit, decontaminate, and archive. The exploration extended over weeks precisely because it could not be done all at once. Tension was constant, the risk of collapse versus the scientific need for precise documentation. Inside the bunker, The initial findings were not great relics, but technical and material signs consistent with the historically described structure. Remains of electrical wiring, metal parts of radio equipment, and an empty fuel tank appeared. In the personal quarters, a rusted bed, remains of a deteriorated blanket, and metal fragments compatible with a collapsed sofa were identified. Samples were taken for chemical and forensic analysis. On interior walls, traces of burning compatible with fires and the effects of the final bombings were observed, marks that acted as material scars of 1945, not narratives. One of the most sensitive discoveries occurred in the communications room. There, a sealed metal cabinet preserved documents in a relatively better state than the rest of the material, protected by the hermetic closure and perhaps by chance. Some papers still showed dates from April 1945. The scene was unsettling. In a space where almost everything was disintegrating, a closed cabinet had functioned as a secondary capsule, preserving fragments of the final administration. By protocol, those documents were not handled on site more than necessary. They were transferred to external laboratories under controlled conditions because exposure to air could accelerate their degradation. Minor personal objects also appeared, but loaded with meaning. Among them, corroded metal glasses and a small deteriorated toy. Their exact origin could not be immediately determined at the time of discovery, but they were considered relevant for a clear reason: the documented presence of the Goebbels family in the bunker during the final days. In such explorations, a small object can carry more weight than a wall because it materially connects the place to a precise human story. Documentation was as important as the discovery. Everything was recorded with high-resolution photography, 3D scanning, and sample collection, with the additional problem that some materials disintegrated upon contact with air. The bunker behaved like an organism that did not tolerate exposure. Every opening altered the balance of humidity, temperature, and pressure. In practical terms, the very act of investigating accelerated deterioration, which is why the methodology had to be surgical: touch little, record much. The final reports of this stage were unequivocal on one point: the structure was in irreversible decay, with constant humidity, extreme corrosion, and partial collapses. However, they also confirmed something that explained why the site had survived demolition attempts. The solidity of the outer walls, built with thicknesses over 3 meters, had allowed a significant part of the complex to remain standing despite explosions, fill-ins, and decades of sealed abandonment. That 2024 descent was therefore more than an entry. It was the first documented human entry in almost 80 years, a break in the continuity of institutional silence, and the way it was carried out revealed something essential. The Führer bunker could no longer be visited as a place. It could only be approached as fragile, dangerous evidence, where every minute underground had to justify its risk with a concrete piece of data. Tests and myth, what remained, what is known, and what never stopped returning. When the Führer bunker reappeared in 2024 as a space explored again, not for the public but for research, something happened that seemed inevitable. The place ceased to be just a historical episode and became once again a field of narrative dispute. Because the bunker is not only a setting, it is a symbol full of contradictions. It is the site of the end of a regime, but also the object of a fascination that never disappeared. It is material evidence, but also a void that for decades was filled with rumors. And above all, it is a reminder that history is not composed only of facts. It is also composed of how those facts are managed, hidden, or shown. The first tension was always the same: the clash between evidence and myth. In the case of Hitler's end, the evidence has existed since 1945, with dental remains identification being a key element to confirm the death. But Soviet opacity created a lasting problem. It did not allow the evidence to become a global public closure. Without access to the evidence, the world did not see the end, and therefore the end continued to be discussed as if it were a theory and not a fact. Doubt fed itself for years. The more it was hidden, the more it was imagined. The bunker, moreover, did what closed spaces do in great tragedies. It became a mental theatre. The last days of the Reich occurred in small, windowless rooms with filtered air, steel doors, and narrow corridors. That architecture became a metaphor, and metaphors are dangerous when mixed with propaganda. For decades, the bunker was used by opposing narratives to show Hitler as a coward locked away while his city died. or to construct an image of final resistance among ruins. Both readings are partial selections of the same scene, and both feed off the mystery left by a buried place. The scientific reopening of 2024 in this sense had strategic value for historical knowledge. It restored materiality to an object that had been excessively abstract. The 3D scanning, deterioration measurements, records of wiring, radio equipment, empty fuel tanks, collapsed corridors, extreme humidity, returned the real image. It was not an intact fortress waiting to be discovered, but a degraded space that could barely hold itself up. This destroys part of the fantasy because it shows that myth does not withstand mold, corrosion, and collapse well. There is also another point. The evidence of the bunker is not only what happened, but how an attempt was made to control what happened. Communication records, for example, reveal a final operational tone, a language that no longer sought to win but to close. The phrase about the absence of exit and the confirmation of the final procedure summarizes a decision. There would be no evacuation, no public surrender. And that choice was not just personal, it was ideological. The idea of dying rather than being captured became an instruction, and the instruction transferred to how bodies, documents, and the subsequent narrative were handled. This is where the myth strengthens, not due to a lack of facts, but due to an excess of deliberate shadows. Partial cremation, improvised burial, transfer of remains to Moscow, secret custody, Stalin's ambiguous statements. Each of these elements was real, and each acted as a multiplier of doubts. History became vulnerable to sensationalism because the Soviet power wanted it to be. And once sensationalism finds space, it is difficult to close it with a phrase or a photo. In that terrain, the great narrative ghosts appear: the double, the escape, the submarine, the route to Spain, the refuge in South America. These stories are, in forensic terms, weak, but in cultural terms they are strong because they function as complete stories. They have a plan, a villain, a secret network, a dramatic escape. Reality, on the other hand, is less cinematic. A man locked in, aged, defeated, who commits suicide in a closed room with a capsule and a gunshot, and is then partially burned in a crater under bombardment. Reality is often too dry to compete with fiction. That is why the importance of the Führer bunker in the present is not only to describe its structure or repeat what happened, it is to understand what it represents in public memory. In Germany, the handling of the place was deliberately anti-spectacle. It was not turned into a museum, it was not turned into an attraction. For years, even visible marking was avoided. The goal was to prevent romanticization, but that strategy had a side effect. It left the space open to global imagination, to sensationalist documentaries, to doubt turned into entertainment. The scientific reopening, however, aimed at another idea: not to make the bunker a place to visit, but an object of documentation. This difference is crucial. Documenting does not mean glorifying. Documenting means recording data, measurements, real plans, verifiable photographs, chemical analyses, three-dimensional scans. All this reduces the margin for myth, though it never eliminates it completely. Because myth, once rooted, is not nourished only by the unknown, it is nourished by the desire to believe. In human terms, the bunker also left a trace that cannot be reduced to Hitler's end. Other people died there, decisions of collective suicide were made there, the murder of Goebbels' children took place there, the moral and psychological collapse of those who had supported the regime until the end was experienced there. And this aspect is fundamental in order not to turn the place into a story centered solely on the dictator. The Führer bunker was not only the tomb of one man, it was a chamber where the final act of a complete system was concentrated, with victims and accomplices trapped in the same underground space. Thus, the closure of the narrative is not an end, but a kind of legacy. The Führer bunker remained as an extreme example of how a regime attempts to control its own downfall, and also as a warning about how state secrecy can generate decades of confusion. In 2024, the scientific return did not unearth a palace, it unearthed a damp and corroded ruin. But that ruin has enormous value, because in the face of myths, the ruin is honest. It does not speak of escape or grandeur. It speaks of confinement, decay, and an end with no way out.